The National 12 was born in 1936, introduced by the RYA, then known as the Yacht Racing Association, with the aim of making sailing accessible to ordinary people. The National 12 was set up as a development class, meaning that the design can evolve with time, staying current as technology changes. Join us as we travel through the evolution of dinghy sailing, journeying through 70 years of development, through to 12 feet of perfection. In 1936, Yachting World magazine approached Uffer Fox to follow up his successful International 14 designs with a design for the newly created 12-foot dinghy class. I've put all I know into this design. It cannot be easily outclassed, and I doubt if it ever will be. The first Uffer King N1 was launched at Cowes in April 1936 and christened Gypsy. Here she is sailing just after launching the Solent. With the creation of the Uffer King, the National 12 class really took off. The 14s of the time could cost as much as £200–300, so the National 12 at £45 was a much cheaper option. As a result, 175 boats were built in the first year alone, and the open meeting circuit boomed, as shown here at Trent Valley Sailing Club. The first National Championships was held at Poole, and an impressive 40 boats took part. The principal trophy was awarded by Sir William Burton, the then chairman of the RYA. This is why the National 12 Championships is known as Burton Week, and the Burton Cup remains the premier race of the week. The Burton Cup race is for 4 laps of a triangular course, with each leg over a mile long. That's a long way to sail in a 12-foot boat. Which, the first Burton Cup winner, is an Uffer King design. She sports a wooden mast, originally had no kicking strap, they hadn't been invented yet, and she weighed in at 225 pounds. She had 3/8 thick clinkers, bulletproof but a little on the heavy side by today's standards. Centre plate was solid metal and weighed 45 pounds, and she had copper buoyancy tanks, which only created a little more positive buoyancy than they weighed. In the early years of dinghy sailing, buoyancy and clothing required as much development as the hulls and rigs. In this open meeting on the River Thames at Ranelagh Sailing Club, the only source of rescue was a rowing boat because the outboard engine had not caught on yet. It was only a few years after the launch of the class that war broke out and dinghy sailing had to take a back seat. But the mere inconvenience of war didn't stop the hardy sailors of Ranelagh. The War Department allowed them to continue sailing on the River Thames as long as their vessels had the regulation numbers painted on them, so it was clear that their National 12s weren't enemy warships. Jack Holt of fittings fame started his National 12 designing career in 1938 and was the only builder to carry on making boats during the war. He was a busy boy. He went on to design the Mirror, the Enterprise, the Solo, the Cadet and the GP14. Now that wood could be used for building boats again, Jack offered kits to budding amateur builders. You could get a National 12 for £118, 13 shillings and 3p. After the war years, dinghy sailing grew in popularity, and there was plenty of space in the market for more classes to pick up different niches. In 1946 the Merlin was launched and soon joined with the Rocket to form the Merlin Rocket. Also in 1946 the Firefly appeared, which was designed by Uffer Fox as an adaptation of the Uffer King. Whilst Donald Campbell was setting the water speed record on Lake Ullswater, Ian Proctor, a keen National 12 sailor and designer, was trying to work out how to make 12s go faster and develop the first metal dinghy masts. The developments proved successful, and he went on to found the company Proctor Metal Masts. In the 1950s, more powerful flared hulls were made, which improved the power-to-weight ratio, and in certain conditions the mysterious performance called planing could be achieved. A few other useful innovations were also made at this time, including the kicking strap, handy downwind, and Terraline sails, which unlike the cotton sails, didn't shrink when wet.
The National class was introduced in 1936 to meet the needs of enthusiasts without the capital to invest in larger yachts. Among other restrictions, Dinghies in this class must not cost more than £137 10 shillings when new, or have a sail area of more than 90 feet. Many, in fact, cost as little as £60 second-hand. Yet the class has produced some of the country's finest helmsmen. Sonda, Can-Can Girl and Typhoo, entrants for the Sir William Burton Cup race, head for the start and wait for the signal. It's virtually impossible to line the yachts up, so 10 minutes before the start, a gun is fired and stopwatch is set. 5 minutes later, a second shot is fired, and in another 5 minutes, a third shot signals they're off.
In the age of flower power and the Beatles, sailing clothing also started to include the latest fashions. The revolutionary Tellerine meant sailing clothing could be waterproof and flexible. The first wetsuits came in, but were made of fairly solid rubber, which made getting into them a challenge. They did look good though. By the early 1960s, Burton Week had grown in popularity, and the fleet was now 200 strong. It was an impressive sight as shown here at Weymouth in 1963, where a warship was needed to mark the start and finish line. Michael Jackson started his designing career in the mid-1960s with March Hare. This design refined the art of planing. Mike took amateur building to the extreme. He designed and built his own boat, along with masts, sails and foils, and then went on to helm her to win Burton Week in 1963. Phil Morrison came into the picture as a designer and the China Doll was born. This design became one of the most popular in the 12 class, with 200 built in the early 70s. By the end of the 1960s, normal people were marvelling over such amazing inventions as the colour TV and getting the first man on the moon. But in the dinghy world, glass-reinforced plastic was becoming the next big thing. The paper dart was novel in the class, being the first off-the-shelf National 12. They were built in glass fibre and supplied with a pre-tuned rig and sails. Despite the arrival of GRP, wood reigned for a while longer, being considered lighter and stiffer. Four-plank plywood construction prompted a wave of amateur building in garages and living rooms across the UK. By the mid-70s, flared trousers were in fashion, and flares were becoming fashionable in 12s too. Penny had dropped that the wider the boat, the more power. In fact, boats started to get so wide that they wouldn't fit in the garage for winter storage. So a maximum width of 2 metres was introduced. Here we see N1 and N2399 side by side, emphasising how wide the 12 had become. A huge amount of experimentation was done in the 70s, and dagger boards proved the most controversial. Joe Richards created the concept of the vertical dagger boards and did rather well in Bouncer, winning Burton Week in 1977. The dagger board performed well on open water, but the class decided to retain rotating centreboards to prevent damage to the boats when sailing in shallow waters. One night after racing in the August of 1977, Joe Richards and Nigel Waller got together in the pub and a revolutionary new design was conceived. With the aid of beer mats to model the shape and a few beers to model hydrodynamics, Punkarella was born. Punkarella was wide and flat and set the scene for the designs of the 80s and 90s. The rig was undergoing changes too. More power was extracted from the sail downwind with a loose-footed main, which could be pulled in tight upwind for best shape and released downwind for more power. This was the decade when many of the fundamental elements of sailing performance were properly understood. The hulls grew to the maximum width, which improved planing performance. Mylar sailcloth was introduced, which held its shape better and also looked pretty racy. At the end of the 80s, the first glass foam sandwich production 12 arrived. The Design 8 was created by Phil Morrison, built by Dave Ovington and marketed by Storer and Bax. Boats of the 80s still offer an unbeatable cheap entry into 12 sailing. Mike Jackson came up with the final chapter design at the start of the 90s. This design has adapted well over the past 16 years and is still available, now in carbon fibre and self-draining. Here's some footage of the early chapters, wishing they were self-draining or were another foot longer at the bow. In the mid-90s, self-draining designs were introduced, removing the need for bailing out, a development much welcomed by crews. Up to this point, carbon fibre had been exclusively used in aerospace parts, but it got cheap enough to be used in both hulls and masts. It increased stiffness and reduced weight, and made rigs more responsive. Here's Bim Zaza, one of the most successful contemporary designers of 12s.
I remember seeing a National 12 at the Dinghy exhibition in about 1985, and I was just blown away by how exciting it looked, how open the design rules were, that you could create your own boat within the rules and have something simply stunning. The Feeling Foolish I designed in 1994. I spent a lot of time looking at the current top designs of the class, which were the Crusader, the baggy trousers and the final chapter. And from that I came up with a concept that I wanted to achieve, which was for a boat with the minimum waterline beam for reducing wave making resistance. I wanted minimum wetted surface area to help in the light winds because of frictional resistance. I wanted a boat that could carry weight, and I wanted a big powerful deck line to help in the breeze when sailing upwind and reaching.
Can you tell us about the thinking behind your second design?
Yes, the Foolish had won for 5 years. However, there was room for improvement, and I spent a lot of time refining the Foolish into a new design using computer modelling techniques, and I came up with the Numinous, which was made its debut in 2000. The Numinous has got a smooth skinned hull, and this makes it an incredibly responsive boat to sail.
Your third design looks very different to the first two.
And that's due to the deck shape. It's got maximum beam, the gunnels are straight basically for half the boat, so that the crew and the helm can hike at maximum beam.
And how did your cheer?
The championships, the Numinous won, and won the Burton Cup as well. The Feeling Foolish came second. It was actually tied on points with the Numinous, and the Paradox came third. So all three designs in the top three. Just delighted. Fantastic.
Over the last 70 years, the average build weight has almost halved. New sail materials such as Kevlar and super light laminates make the sails stronger and lighter. Carbon fibre masts provide even more control of the rig, which is particularly good for lightweight crews. And whilst the boats have been getting lighter, they have also been getting stiffer as the structural designs are optimised. Also, a few pounds were lost by getting rid of the brass fittings and Tufnell pulleys. To date, 3,500 National 12s have been built. The modern carbon fibre boats have come a long way from the first designs in 1936, and the Class Association embraces all ages and shapes of National 12s.